January 28, 2020 Planning Commission Transportation Committee meeting. This committee last met at an in-person meeting, and this is our first virtual meeting. The purpose of this committee is for focused discussion related to transportation in the city of Raleigh related to land use issues. This committee, like the Planning Commission, will likely operate in a virtual environment through the spring. I would like to ask for your patience as we use this platform for our public meetings. There may be slight delays as we transition between speakers, presentations, and participants. If any participants have issues with the technology, please send a message to the moderator. There's one discussion item on our agenda today. The topic is traffic impact analysis process for rezoning. The intention of this topic is to gain a better understanding of how traffic impact is analyzed during the course of rezoning case review. We have staff in transportation planning and development here to provide an overview of the topic. I would also ask each commissioner to be recognized by the chairperson before speaking. Also, because this meeting is immediately preceding the Committee of the Whole meeting, which starts at 4, we will adjourn this meeting approximately 10 minutes before 4, so we can transition to that meeting. The one item on our agenda today is the process to review traffic impacts associated with rezoning requests. Traffic is often cited as a concern with rezoning requests, and it will be helpful to understand the staff review process and decode some of the consistent concerns. This is an informational discussion item, and I suspect that we may need more than one meeting to explore the topic. City staff and transportation planning will lead the discussion and answer questions. If there are follow-up questions or additional information requested, staff can return at the next meeting in February to continue the conversation. Conlon from Transportation Planning will present on behalf of city staff. Ann, I'll turn it over to you now.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and share. Okay, are you all seeing the appropriate presentation view?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So I am going to aim to spend about 20 minutes with the assistance of John in walking through this process at a high level, and then hopefully we can go from there based on your questions to guide the rest of the discussion. So as you said, thanks for the introduction. My name is Ann Conlon. I joined the Transportation Planning Group in early December, and my current role is as TIA reviewer. I have a couple touch points with the rezoning process. First, I help the planning group determine when a TIA is necessary for rezoning, and then if it is, I help review it and get the next steps from it. I'm going to let John introduce himself when we get to his section here, a couple of slides. So I'm going to focus on these 5 questions to help you all understand what are we trying to achieve when we walk through a traffic impact analysis at rezoning? What are the triggers and what needs to be in it that we're reviewing? How are other modes addressed, transit, pedestrian, bicycle, and then what are the outcomes that come out of this process? So to start with, what is the goal? At rezoning, we have a slightly different question that we are trying to answer with the TIA. And what we're trying to do is help the Planning Commission understand what is the impact of approving this change in entitlement. So we are specifically looking at traffic impacts of the change. So that would be looking at the existing entitlement and the proposed and focusing on the difference. I'm going to keep coming back to that point because that's a key aspect of the rezoning TIA. And I thought it was useful in some of this discussion to compare it to the sort of analysis we do at site review. In that case, we're specifically looking at what are they actually building and what are the impacts of that and identifying the appropriate mitigations. But again, coming back to the TIA at rezoning, we are looking at what are the impacts of this change in entitlement. Is there an ability to mitigate those impacts in the future when the development comes? And clearly, identifying those impacts for the public, since we know the public has a lot of interest in traffic, and these questions come up, as you said, at this phase in the project. So the next question then is what triggers a TIA? How do we determine whether or not to ask an applicant for a TIA at rezoning? And again, we're looking at this change in entitlement. So we look at what are the existing trips that might come out of the development of a piece of land. If you look at how it's zoned now, you develop it out, how many trips would that generate? And then we look at, if we change the zoning to this proposed zoning, how many trips is that? And we focus on the difference. So it's additional new trips that we are studying. And there are specific guidelines on what that difference is in the Raleigh Street Design Manual. So that manual tells us, okay, if that difference is over a certain threshold, depending on the type of street, then that's a change that we need to study and understand in detail. And anyone can access that City of Raleigh Street Design Manual on the website. So now if we know there's a certain trigger when we need to do a TIA, how do we estimate how many trips would come out of the site? So this is a two-part process. The first step in the process is using the Envision Tomorrow tool to identify what might this site build out as. And that's what John is going to walk through in just a second. And then we take that projection from that tool and we rely on an industry guide called the Trip Generation Manual. This is a guide put out by the Institute of Transportation Engineers. And that tells us if a site were to build out, with a certain number of residential units or square feet of office space, then we expect it to generate this many trips. And that manual is based on real life developments all around the country. It's empirically based. So John and his team do the first step of the Envision Tomorrow, and then they pass that information over to us in the transportation group, and we estimate the trips and determine if they meet those thresholds in the street design manual. So I want to let John spend some time on this Envision Tomorrow piece, because that's an important step in the process.
Thanks, Anne. I am John Anagnost. I work in the Comprehensive Planning Division. I am one of the case planners for rezoning cases. And just for a bit of extra information, before I became what's called at the city a senior planner, I was what's called a planner, which is the actual staff who do the Envision analysis during the rezoning process. So I am pretty familiar with the way that this spreadsheet system works. And so Envision Tomorrow is a very detailed set of formulas built into a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. And my understanding is it was originally created as a sort of pro forma support tool for the development community. But it has a pretty wide range of applications because it does have a lot of factors that are built into it. And so the way that we use it is, like Anne was saying, to test both the existing zoning and the proposed zoning. And what it produces as a result is the amount of, at the basic level, the amount of floor area that can be produced for a given site for each of the units that are specified in the spreadsheet. And those are typically organized into office, retail, residential, and industrial. And then from those floor areas, there can be a conversion to various other outputs such as dwelling units or hotel units. Next slide, please. And so the way that we use the spreadsheet to actually produce those results is we take the parking requirements from the UDO and we add those into the spreadsheet. So that comes from Raleigh and is specific to Raleigh zoning. And then the spreadsheet has places where we put the acreage of the site, the building height that's allowed, and then we can control for other things like tree conservation area, outdoor amenity area, and we can also think through if the block perimeter requirements are going to cause there to be new public streets to be dedicated through the site. We can start to make some projections of what those might be. We do tend to be pretty conservative with those. We don't want to overestimate the amount of streets, but there are usually some pretty obvious indications from a site's context. But those are the kind of assumptions that we can build in. And then we can, if we have zoning conditions that apply additional open space or restrictions on setbacks or landscaping, we can build those into the spreadsheet as well. And then we also can specify a percentage of the different uses that we want to test in different scenarios. And so what those will do is then it kind of creates a feedback mechanism where the inputs that you put into the site constraints and the building height and the site area will then feed into how much parking is required by the amount of building footprint you have. And the spreadsheet basically creates this optimization loop where it's going to optimize the balance between the building footprint and the number of stories and how much parking you need to serve that building. And the parking can also be set either to be surface parking or structure parking, depending on the context. And we use surrounding development and the typical, what we see in a particular area to make some assumptions about the type of parking that we would expect. And so those are all the kind of things that go into it. And then it will produce the square footages that we then pass along to transportation planning. And so that's what you see here. I think what is oftentimes confusing about the table that you see in the staff report is that the maximums you see at the bottom of the table represent the maximum that was found to be possible under any of the scenarios that we tested in Envision Tomorrow. So those maximums are not cumulative. So in this example, you probably would not be able to have 500 dwelling units and 350,000 square feet of office. Those were usually, if we tested a scenario that was almost completely residential and another scenario that was almost completely office, those were the maximum. But we generally don't actually show you the single scenario that led to the maximum trip generation that's then being shown in the transportation impacts analysis section of the staff report. And so I understand that that can be confusing at times. Next slide, please. And so this is what we actually see from comprehensive planning's view and what we send to transportation planning to then generate the trip generation numbers from the ITE manual. And so you can see the different types of scenarios that we test, and those are based on the proposed and existing and proposed zoning. So what uses are allowed in those zoning districts? And then if the applicant has offered conditions to restrict particular uses, say setting a maximum commercial component of 20,000 square feet or something, we can build that in to this. But we also have some kind of rule of thumb assumptions that we use based on what we expect from the market. For instance, we never assume more than one story of retail. There are some instances, Crabtree Valley Mall, for example, where there are multiple floors of retail, but typically in today's market, we're not seeing the suburban style shopping mall anymore. And we're not seeing, in some big cities like Chicago, you will see skyscrapers that do have 4 or 5 floors of retail at the base, but we don't see that in our market, so we don't ever make that assumption. So those are the kind of things that we think about, but generally the goal of this is to say, based on what the applicant is proposing or what the existing zoning is, what is the maximum amount of floor area of these uses that can be produced on this site? Next slide, please. And I'll turn it back over to Anne. I think this is where she comes in.
Okay, thanks, John. So after we get those results from John, we take them and we, as I said, we project the trips for the existing entitlement and look at what is the traffic associated with that. And then we also look at the full build out of the proposed entitlement and the associated traffic, and we compare the two. So the comparison in our traffic impact analysis is not with the site. If the site is vacant, we're not focused on that vacant condition. We're specifically focused on what you can build out now and the traffic associated with it and what you could under the proposed zoning. And then we look at, okay, are there impacts that need to be mitigated with these additional trips with this proposed zoning? What are they? Are they feasible? And those mitigations would be provided in the report. Again, just as to give you a sense of how this compares to what's done at site review, in that case, we are looking at what a no build versus a build. So we're looking specifically at what the development is proposing, not what they could propose, and what's there now, and comparing to. So it's a different comparison. And then there are some other elements to a full TIA that's done at that stage, because that's when all the mitigations that are necessary for things like safety or multimodal considerations are actually being assigned to a party, either to the private developer or to the city. Whereas at the rezoning stage, what we're trying to do is just identify what the mitigations are that need to get put into place later, but they're not being put into place at the time of this TIA. So another question that's come up to us is, how is transit and pedestrian and bicycle travel addressed? When we look at trip generation, we are thinking about those trips in the sense that we're estimating vehicular trips by taking into account the type of site and the site context, and whether or not it's producing those other modal trips. If the ITE trip generation manual in the last edition has gotten more nuanced and better accounts for things like sites in a dense multi-urban context. And so it projects fewer trips in that context from vehicles, because people are making the trips with these other modes. And that way we make sure we're not, looking to overbuild the vehicular infrastructure at the expense of these other modes. So the site context is one input into the trip generation. If you have a mixed use site, we expect pedestrian trips between uses. That's one of the great benefits of that kind of development. And so that we call internal capture, and that reduces the vehicular trips to and from the site. And then we're also just looking at what is the infrastructure, transit, pedestrian, bicycle infrastructure around the site, and we can apply a reduction beyond what the ITE trip generation manual is telling us if the site is very well connected and we anticipate even more use of those nodes. So finally, what are the outcomes that we're looking for from a TIA? What are we trying to provide to you all? We're trying to answer the question for the Planning Commission of, can the current infrastructure support traffic if this site is built out at the proposed rezoning level? If it can't, then are there appropriate mitigations that could address that issue, that can be, again, have their responsibility assigned at the level of development of the site? And if we don't think that there is any way really to mitigate those, then are there some conditions that can help bring the build out back down to a level where we can achieve infrastructure sufficiency? So those are the big picture outcomes. So with that, I want to open this up to discussion and hear your questions.
Thank you, Andy and John. I'm waiting to get my screen back so I can see everybody. Okay. Thank you again. I have a few questions, but I'll defer to others first. Do any of the other committee members have questions? Okay. On the slide, it was one of your first slides where you had the side-by-side and you were talking about, this is what we do during the rezoning and this is what we do during site design and analysis. I thought that was a really important slide, because I can tell from a lot of the questions that we get, and even some of the questions I had before I started doing this, that we get confused. And sometimes the questions that we're asking during rezoning are more site analysis type questions. So I was going to suggest that it would be nice to remind everybody during our meetings when we're looking at these cases and evaluating the traffic impacts, I don't know, maybe even in the staff report, just a sentence or two. This is what we're looking at during the rezoning. we're not looking at this. And then maybe we won't get some of those questions, the very specific type traffic impact questions. That's just a suggestion, but my question was, does this differ when we're looking at planned developments? Are you looking at more, is it more like a site analysis when we're looking at planned developments versus a regular rezoning, or is it the same?
That's a great question, and I am going to ask Eric to chime in on that question for me.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm Eric Lamb with the City's Transportation Department in charge of transportation planning. A planned development application is like a combination of a rezoning and a site plan. So our charge would be to look at a higher degree of information associated with a PD application because the entitlement that's taking place there is not just a change in the land use, but you're actually approving layouts, access points, and whatnot. So there's a much higher degree of specificity that's required as part of the PD submittal process. And accordingly, the traffic analysis is much sharper at that point. Now, one of the things that's a challenge on PD specifically is when developers are looking to leave flexibility within the development, because oftentimes we will get applications and the PD is broken up into tracts, in different pods, and the developer, if they don't have everything lined up as far as tenancy, they're looking to maintain their flexibility. And that can create a challenge for us trying to determine with the mix of residential, retail, commercial, office, those can fluctuate within those pods, and trying to determine what is a probable worst case, and that's what we're always trying to look at with traffic studies. What is the worst possible outcome that could result from that PD? And so that's always a challenge, is trying to dial that in and understand what the developer is trying to accomplish, how much flexibility is left within each of those land areas, and how to represent that.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions? I was making a list during the presentation, so I don't want to dominate. Okay. Let's see, some of these aren't questions, they're just more, I'm sort of underscoring clarifications just to make sure everybody understands. One of the things that you mentioned, Anne, is the distinction between the no build and the build, and understanding that the no build isn't necessarily the vacant condition. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of times we're assuming, and maybe some members of the communities are assuming what they see today, the traffic that's generated if there's nothing on the site versus what's being proposed. And so sometimes we hear, well, there will only be 20 new trips. And you hear people in the public go, that's insane, your traffic study is wrong. It's going to be more than that. But I think there's a misunderstanding that you're saying 20 additional trips over what can be generated with the existing zoning versus what could be generated with the proposed zoning. Is that right?
That's correct. And I think we can, as transportation staff, really try to underscore that when it comes up at a meeting and we're providing input to you.
And then moving on to the multimodal considerations, because I did get an email from someone with BPAC, and they were particularly interested in this discussion. In terms of lots of times the mitigation and the conditions that we add to try to mitigate traffic concerns are to the detriment of pedestrian and bicycle travel. It seemed like what your presentation said was it was more at the site review process that you start considering those multimodal types of travel. Did I misunderstand that? Or I guess my question is there anything that we can do now to build into the rezoning process when we're looking at it to make sure we're looking out for transit, bikes, pedestrians, in addition to the traffic or vehicular traffic?
Yeah, I can start to answer that. And then I see Jason Myers is with us, and I think he could add something. With the TIA itself, we are focusing on what mitigations might we need for the vehicular trips. Again, just because it's trying to answer that question of, is this entitlement going to create an issue with infrastructure sufficiency? But I know that Jason in his staff report also looks in a lot of detail at kind of how this fits in with the overall multimodal transportation network. And so I think the consideration is there from that side. Is there anything you want to say about that, Jason?
Yeah, I think that the report or the content you have in every staff report for a zoning case is partly meant to address all of those things and try to paint as good of a picture as we can with words, unfortunately, mostly words, what the context of the transportation system is right now and what development on this site would result in, whether that's changes in block perimeter, whether that's new construction of sidewalk and those sorts of things. It's much harder to try to assign kind of values to a zoning case for those sorts of things, because for the most part, any development of a piece of property is going to result in the same thing, regardless of what the zoning is. So, it may be that transportation, from our point of view, we want to make sure a piece of property develops because the frontage improvements are going to take a chunk of a capital project and finish it for us, which is a good thing. But whether that's developed under the current zoning or the future zoning doesn't necessarily fit into that calculation. So it's really a question then for Planning Commission understanding what the requirements of the UDO are from a transportation standpoint and what the context is around there. Is this the right thing to do with zoning, and is it consistent with the plan overall? And we're just trying to provide that information. And I do value any input that you might be able to provide about how to do that better. Maybe more information is not better information, but I'm not sure where to zero in on at this point. So.
Okay, thanks, Jason. I guess as you mentioned, we're trying to determine consistency. So I guess to the extent that multimodal transportation is a priority in the comprehensive plan, that would be reflected in the various consistency statements. So it sounds like it would be up to us to determine if certain conditions or improvements or mitigations are consistent with the priorities of the comprehensive plan. So, I mean, if there's some sort of disconnect, or if we feel like bike and ped and transit aren't being prioritized, it's more of a comp plan issue and not necessarily something that we can take care of in the rezoning. Is that right? Or is there more that we can do at the rezoning stage? Or is it just, I don't know, having conversations with BPAC? I don't know.
I see Eric turned his video on. He may have some good thoughts here too. I do think conversations with BPAC may be helpful, but BPAC is really kind of roughly half of our transportation system in a sense. If we have 4 modes, there are 2 of those modes. There is another body for transit, and I guess in some ways this group is who's responsible for street planning, which is probably the most comprehensive mode. I think there is probably some more things that can be done through rezoning, because there are certainly some opportunities that offer zoning conditions about infrastructure or about site design that affect things from a transportation standpoint. It's usually, I think, from what I've seen, distracting enough from what Planning Commission's concerns usually are, or the public's concerns are, that to kind of take a detour into that area is going to add more time that you don't necessarily want to spend on a case. And that an applicant generally certainly doesn't want to spend on a case, because from their point of view, time is usually money. So it's not that there's a huge opportunity that's being missed. I certainly don't think that's the case. And if it's important to you all to find those things, then then maybe the very few of them that exist need to be called out more in the staff reports, but they should be there to the extent that somebody is really focused on them.
Eric?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So Jason, Ann, and I, in many cases, are coming at pedestrian and bicycle facilities from the infrastructure side of the equation. And most of us, have the engineering background. From the planning side of it, it's really the difference between pedestrian accessibility versus pedestrian orientation. And that's a big key. And how do you achieve pedestrian orientation? There's really two primary factors. One is the mix of uses, that you create opportunities for walkability by having different resources within walkable distances. The other is urban form, both in the public realm and in the design of the buildings, that creates an environment that is conducive and encouraging to walking. And so as you're looking at it from the land use side of the equation, one of the problems can be, for example, if you have large areas of homogeneous uses, for example, large swaths of exclusively residential development, or areas that are exclusively office related. Those types of developments can be problematic because they can, one, be isolated, and two, because there's no mix of uses associated with those types of developments, can lead to higher percentages of car trips as a percentage of the overall daily trips. Whereas if you have more mixed use development, and we've seen research from ITE and other places where, as we talk about trip capture, how much of the traffic generated by those land uses, the trip capture can be as much as 50% for a dense, vertically integrated mixed-use development. So that's a 50% reduction in the total amount of traffic generated by that development, compared to if that same amount of land uses were allowed to develop in a scattershot or spread out manner. So those parts of the equation are really important. As we're looking at it from the mitigation side, there can be conflicts, and I think we talked about this on a recent zoning case, how some of the mitigations that were being proposed, the development was large enough to warrant things like double right turns and triple left turns. And those types of mitigations can be problematic from the pedestrian side of the equation, because you're creating larger intersections and larger spaces that pedestrians have to cross, and creating conflicts with turning movements in the intersection that can lead to safety concerns for pedestrians, and also just not feeling good as a space that someone will walk across. And so what we do is make sure that the commission and the city council, in the consideration of these types of cases, gets an understanding for those types of trade-offs.
Commissioner Winters or Lampman, do you have any questions? I recall you saying something like that, Eric, when we were looking at a case on Buffalo Road. And I know that one comes up a lot because of all the traffic on Buffalo Road. And I recall you saying something to the effect of what you just said, that the way to reduce the vehicular trips was to have more of a mix of uses, and concentrating so much residential was just going to increase the need for vehicular trips to get to the other uses. So I try to keep that in mind when I'm looking at cases on not just that road, but roads where we continually hear that traffic is a problem. What can we do to mitigate the impacts? And speaking of Buffalo Road and roads like that, is there any type of opportunity to look at traffic? I know it's a rezoning level, but at a systems level? So there's so many cases, for example, proposed on Buffalo Road. And we'll hear, but this particular proposal is only, the incremental increase is very small. But then when we look at all of the proposed development, the cumulative increase might be significant. So when we're being told we need to look on a case-by-case basis, but we know that it's a much larger effect than that particular case, is there anything that we can do from a, I guess, evaluation standpoint? Is there any way for the transportation staff to take a look at, well, we have all of these proposals along Buffalo Road in the last year or so. This is the total amount of traffic that's projected to be generated. Or is that not fair to each applicant?
I think that's an especially fair question for Buffalo Road, and frankly, it's something that everybody struggles with. It's not just a Raleigh issue. It's the whole notion of the first developers into an area get the benefit of being able to utilize the system capacity that's available. It's the later developers that come in, if there's no corresponding public investment to increase capacity, that end up having to deal with those frustrations of working through that. Buffalo Road is a great example of a situation where it depends on which part of Buffalo Road you're talking about. And we're less concerned about the net traffic generation on Buffalo Road inside of the outer loop, west of I-540, but more so with the traffic that is east of the outer loop. And it's a mix of several different things. One, you do have a lot of homogeneous land development with not a big mix of uses out in that particular area. Two, the network is somewhat constrained because of a number of natural constraints and some man-made. You've got both 540 and the Neuse River that create a barrier of sorts. And so there's a limited locations where that traffic can either access 540 and or across the Neuse River. And so that's what makes the area east of 540 particularly difficult in some cases. I think, as we've explained to the commission previously, we do have substantial plans for investment in the transportation network in that area, with additional crossings of 540, additional interchanges that are planned in that area, but those have yet to come to fruition. So the challenge to the commission is, in light of what is the system plan for that area versus the circumstances on the ground today, is the zoning request at hand appropriate for those conditions or not? Or is there some compromise? And one of the things that we've done in a few cases is when it's a conditional use case, we've asked applicants to limit phases of the build out until certain key pieces of infrastructure were in place. For example, allowing the developer to go ahead and begin the development and at least get 50% of the total yield of the property, but not being able to develop the second or third phase until, for example, an extra travel lane is added, or there's a new bridge over the Neuse River, something that one, we can tie to discreetly and interpret cleanly as a zoning condition, and two, allows the developer to make some progress on development of the property without freezing the entire thing. Unfortunately, it's our aesthetic in this market that historically we've tended to chase the development with public infrastructure. Oftentimes we work with the developers to make as many improvements with their frontages as possible, but we have some legal limitations on how much off-site improvements we can require from development, and that can propose a challenge.
Commissioner Lampman?
That was really good feedback. Thank you, Eric. One of the other things I'm thinking about as we talk about developers who are first there get the benefit of, but a lot of times too, they're also kind of pioneering in other ways. So they're facing other struggles. And so I would say that the struggles that are faced by new developers versus old developers are, for the most part, they're all weighted out. So I would just, I don't think, we should say that new developers are, kind of hard up in this area. There were just a different balance. The other question I wanted to ask was, and I am very sorry if you covered this, I do apologize. The influence of NCDOT, I understand, is having, NCDOT is having their own significant challenges financially. How does that impact, because I know like on Old Buffalo Road, When you get closer to the 540, that became like the light there was NCDOT jurisdiction versus Raleigh jurisdiction. So how is all of that how are you guys navigating that, and how can we understand what might be a Raleigh thing versus a state thing? And I do apologize if that was covered. Very sorry.
No, I don't think anybody has talked about that. And Jason, Ann, feel free to jump in. I think that the big slowdown that we've seen is on their major capital projects. And so as a result of their financial troubles, which have been compounded by 2 major natural disasters in the last several years, and then the size of the settlement that was associated with the southern portion of the outer loop, not within Raleigh. And then just the economy in general has put them in a very difficult position to move their major capital projects forward. But it's also affected all their parts of the program. You talk about traffic signals, and that's certainly another one. All of the major roads in our area are generally, rule of thumb, maintained by NCDOT. And as we're looking at not so much with the rezoning case side of things, but with site plan specifically, as we do traffic impact analyses, we're working with NCDOT on jointly scoping studies and jointly reviewing those studies. NCDOT has a little more statutory authority to require things from development than municipalities do, but we work very collaboratively with them on coming up with those suites of improvements. But it's really on the capital side, major projects such as planned widening project along US 401, a major widening project along Glenwood Avenue. Those are funded, scheduled projects that have now been pushed back. So I think as it ties back to the zoning arena, that it becomes a question of whether or not the proposal that's before the commission is appropriate in light of the circumstances with a possible NCDOT project. I'll use an example of if you had a project along Glenwood Avenue for a widening, and we've got multiple projects along Glenwood that we're working with NCDOT on now. And let's say one project is 5 years out and you receive a rezoning application that generates a certain level of intensity that would be difficult to address with the current traffic situation, but will be manageable with NCDOT's improvements. Is that case appropriate to move forward with now, or to defer decisions on that case until DOT's work is in place? It's there's no right answer there, no wrong answers. It's a matter of how much the community is willing to tolerate. You mentioned developers that develop on the pioneers in new areas, and water and sewer very specifically is one of those major investment items that new developers in burgeoning areas often have to deal with more of that brunt than later developers do. And water and sewer is a very critical resource. If toilets don't flush, it's a big problem. Traffic is a little bit different because there's a social aspect to that people are willing to tolerate certain amounts of congestion that don't necessarily, they represent adversity from a quality of life standpoint, but not necessarily from a safety standpoint in certain cases. So it's a softer pain to have to deal with in some cases. Jason, Ann, anything to add on that?
I'm glad Commissioner Lampman brought up NCDOT because that was my next question. Was oftentimes we'll get comments or questions saying, has NCDOT reviewed this? Or what did NCDOT say about this? Or sometimes, can someone from NCDOT be at the meeting? We can ask these questions. And NCDOT does not get involved until the site plan review, right? I just wanted to make sure, I'm trying to address a lot of the questions that we see consistently now, but I have seen that one quite a bit, and I just wanted to make sure we underscored that it's the city at the rezoning phase, and then you start coordinating with NCDOT at the site review phase.
Yeah, I can answer that one. That's absolutely correct. Because NCDOT they're not interested in the rezoning, right? They just care once it's actually getting built. I guess the only thing I will add to that is that sometimes a developer wants to go through and look at the analysis kind of holistically to cover rezonings all the way through development. And in those cases, we do engage with NCDOT, and we coordinate and we scope that at the beginning, and they end up doing the rezoning scenarios and the build scenarios all at the same time. But that's generally, they don't engage at rezoning.
Okay, thanks. We have about 5 more minutes. Are there any other questions? This has been really helpful. I appreciate the discussion. I was thinking as we're going through this, Travis, this may be more of a question for you. Is there any place on the Planning Commission page where we can have like a frequently asked questions or something, and we can have answers to these general type questions like this, or maybe post the difference between the traffic analysis and the rezoning versus the traffic analysis at site review? Just something general that might be helpful. We could refer people to sort of educational.
Sure, that's a great question, and that's something that staff could explore, not just related to traffic or transportation impacts, but more generally questions that come up during the rezoning or development process. So we are always looking as a department and as a city for educational opportunities. I know that we as a staff have been talking with communications staff about how we can spread the message of planning and how we could explain, what it is that we actually do with the city, which I think would be pretty valuable. So this is all very timely for us, and that's a good question that we could explore. And I'll be sure to pass that along to our communication staff to see what we can do on our website and our other digital platforms.
Great, thanks. This has been really helpful for me. Has it been helpful for everybody else? Do you think, commissioners, do you think we need to continue this at our next meeting, just more of this general type discussion, answering more of the, providing more of the tools, I guess, to help everybody understand the traffic assessment process? So we don't really have specific cases yet that have been referred to this committee, so we can continue this general discussion as long as transportation staff has stuff to say. Okay, well, I'll work with Travis and with transportation staff and try to come up with some additional items, yes, to continue the discussion for our next meeting. But I really appreciate you all giving us this presentation and having this discussion. I found it helpful. I hope everybody else has, and anybody that's watching. And I just want to make sure, John, we didn't have any questions from any of the participants?
No, I have not received any questions in the chat from attendees.
Okay, great. Well, then this will conclude this meeting of the Transportation Committee, and our next meeting will be Thursday, February 25th at 3 p.m. And commissioners, I'll see you at the Committee of the Whole meeting. Thank you. Bye-bye.